Hello, History 362. So today I want to talk a little bit more about how kings control cities and the limits of that control. And again, the ideal for almost all the kings is this concept of freedom, eleutheria, autonomy, for a city to be autonomous, under its own laws. This is something that Hellenistic kings pay a lot of lip service to, even if reality there is a kind of spectrum that runs from freedom to unfreedom, and most cities kind of fall in the middle of that spectrum. Now, last time we talked about the most sort of heavy-handed way that a king can control a city, which is namely to place a garrison, a phorura in Greek, in that city, so that armed soldiers commanded by a phoruarch, a garrison commander, basically control a strategic spot of the city. Oftentimes it's citadel or fortress. And so this is how, for example, the Antigonids control Athens by placing a large garrison at the Piraeus, the port of Athens. Now, that being said, kings not only have only so many soldiers, they also only have so much money to pay that soldiers, although sometimes the city may be required to partially or in whole support that garrison. The vast majority of Hellenistic cities, Hellenistic polis, are ungarrisoned, simply because the kings just don't have the troops. Although the cities themselves will sometimes sponsor a garrison to help protect the city. And in some instances, large cities will garrison smaller cities. Again, remember that there are still small polis that are subordinate to larger ones, and they might actually have a garrison that the larger city puts in the smaller city. Now, for the Antigonids, for the Kingdom of Macedonia, the big garrisons, the really important garrisons that are permanent, are in key strategic areas in Greece. And these are referred to by the Greeks as the fetters, or the handcuffs of Greece. And there's three big garrisons in addition to the Piraeus that make up these fetters. The first key fetter, and indeed one that will, over the course of the 3rd century, change hands a few times, is the Acrocorinth. So Corinth, a city that is on the isthmus of Corinth that runs from central Greece and then into the Peloponnese, obviously because that's such a narrow land route, it's of key strategic importance. Along this route rises a huge, giant rock, and this is the Acrocorinth. Which is not quite in the city of Corinth, but sort of looms above it. It's a huge fortification. It's been fortified repeatedly by different powers throughout history, and has, for much of Hellenistic history, an Antigonid garrison in it. And the strength of that garrison varies. It's anywhere from 400 to 1,500 according to our sources. So a lot of soldiers, but again, remember, Hellenistic kings who are constrained in terms of both manpower and money, can't put infinite people. So even in an incredibly important garrison, during wartime, it seems to at most have about 1,500 Macedonians. That can be increased if other contingents are moving through in a very short-term sense. That's a very important spot which the Antigonids are sure to keep garrisoned. So that's one place that the Macedonian king keeps a garrison in the city of Corinth. The next key fetter is going to be Chalcis, which lies on the island of Euboea, right on the strait that separates Euboea from mainland Greece. And this is a very long, narrow strait. So this is a key kind of communication route if you're moving goods up the Greek mainland. And Chalcis, therefore, sort of sits on this choke point. This also has a Macedonian garrison and is a key strategic point, one of the fetters of Greece. The final fetter is Demetrius. Demetrius is in Thessaly, but it's on the coast. It's on the Bay of Volos. It is, because of this position in this big, broad harbor, also a really critical strategic point because of the sort of land-sea interface. And so that's going to have a big Macedonian garrison. So those are places that the Macedonian kings are putting garrisons. There are, of course, smaller garrisons in Greece, and of course the Seleucids and Ptolemies also have city garrisons. But again, most cities are ungarrisons. Most cities are not strategic enough to warrant a large garrison like Chalcis or Acrocorinth or Demetrius. By and large, most cities do not have to endure the permanent presence of the soldiers of the king. Although, again, in wartime, the king may actually move a lot of troops around and may garrison cities during the emergency of a war that ordinarily wouldn't be garrisoned in peacetime. The other thing that a king can want from cities is tribute, foros. Here the levels of tribute are going to vary widely from city to city. And there is an element of negotiation that cities oftentimes will engage in. We do know that cities that have a high tribute, a high foros levied upon them, will try and will send representatives. Sometimes, will have people who have a tie to the city will be in the royal court, and they'll try to bargain that tribute down as best they can. Sometimes also, cities, say a king is forcing a city to submit, sometimes cities will opt to make a voluntary gift to the king rather than having to endure an annual tribute. Because again, while the Greeks understand there's kind of a spectrum of freedom, and some cities that do endure tribute will continue to call themselves free or autonomous. But that being said, when the Greeks think about what makes you unfree, what are the ingredients of unfreedom? A garrison is a big ingredient of unfreedom. Paying direct, regular tribute to the king is a big ingredient of unfreedom. And of course, having a royal representative make your laws or suffering laws imposed upon you, rather than making your own laws through your boule, through your council and your ecclesia, your assembly. Those are those are the big ingredients of freedom. Even if some cities have some but not others, and sometimes will still consider themselves free. There are cities that have a garrison, but will say that they are autonomous. Many cities either pay some form of tribute or make irregular contributions to a king sometimes as needed. So a city may not be subject to regular tribute, but there may be an expectation from the king that if he's at war, that city will voluntarily, out of the goodness of its heart, supply the king with wagons, wine, supplies, grain, etc. Tribute is something that some cities do have to pay, although again, if you pay tribute, there's some sense that you are not fully free, just as if you have a garrison, you are not fully free. That being said, many cities do have a degree of autonomy, of even what approaches the ideal of autonomy, even if they may fall within a king's sphere of influence, and even if they realize that there are sort of constraints on their autonomy. They can't go too far outside what the king wants without facing some kind of consequence, which might involve the king, at worst, moving against that city with his army. And cities, again, free cities, oftentimes will do their best to maintain good relations with the king. Even cities that are setting their own agenda through their assembly and their council, those assemblies and councils may still be pursuing policies that are the policies that are pleasing to the king, because they know that that's the best sort of way forward for the prosperity of the city. There are ways, both formal and informal, that a king can liaison with the city without necessarily dominating it. So it's not uncommon for a king to have an agent in the city, the most frequent title of this agent is an epistates. This can kind of mean like a supervisor, but oftentimes the epistates will actually be a citizen of that city who has some kind of connection to the king. And oftentimes he doesn't actually have formal powers over the city. He's more of a kind of liaison. So, for example, if the city is perhaps pursuing something that would make the king unhappy, the epistates can sort of go before the council or go before the assembly and say, I'm really worried what King Antiochus or King Antigonus or King Ptolemy will say about X or Y policy. And then the council can say, if this would really displease the king, maybe we should table this motion for now. So there you have, again, someone who doesn't have formal power, someone who's not a tyrant or dictator imposed upon that city, but someone who can nonetheless be the king's acknowledged representative in that city, so that the city can sort of not go too far out of what the king may want. Also, kings, even if they don't have a formal sort of recognized epistates, may have guest friends in the city. So there may be a citizen, again, who just has a connection with the royal court. He may receive, the king may simply pay him, give him money, and that citizen acts informally as an agent of the king, providing information, shaping public opinion, kings have a lot of these sort of agents, these guest friends, throughout various cities. So it's an informal way that kings can influence the politics of a city through well-connected, again, informal agents. And of course, when I mean agent, most people, it would oftentimes be quite transparent. Many people in that city would acknowledge that so-and-so is a guest friend of the king, and understand that when he speaks, he may be speaking on behalf of the king. A sort of less formal version of the more formal epistates, which is a full-on acknowledged title and position. So these are informal ways that kings can kind of nudge cities without the more heavy-handed option of putting a garrison of armed soldiers there. And of course, many cities are actually happy to work with kings. One advantage of a Hellenistic king is that for many cities, he's extremely far away. And also, those Hellenistic kings oftentimes have eliminated the hegemonic city that is close by. So, for example, with Hellenistic or Macedonian kings keeping a thumb on Athens, there's plenty of cities that had felt intimidated by Athens even in the 4th century after the Peloponnesian War. Likewise with Thebes. Thebes had exerted at times very violent control over Boeotia and central Greece, and there were cities that were happy when Alexander sacked it, helped him sack it. So the fact that kings are sort of they're the devil that you know, and they're also a devil that's far away, and it may be better to be able to acknowledge the suzerainty of a distant Hellenistic king than go back to the kind of anarchic interstate environment of many poleis competing with one another, and of course some poleis therefore dominating others directly. At any rate, the relationship between a Hellenistic king and various cities is going to be one that undergoes constant negotiation. And again, remember, Hellenistic kings, they are military resources, while far more powerful than the resources of any polis, are still finite. Hellenistic kings would invariably rather negotiate with various Greek poleis on their peripheries rather than take the extraordinary effort to try to besiege them. As we've seen, sieges can be extraordinarily difficult, expensive, time-consuming, and sometimes futile. And we actually have, and we'll talk about some of these as we go on in the course, we have in many instances long exchanges between cities and Hellenistic kings as both sides practice the same kind of polite diplomatic language, as both sides engage in back and forth give and take, and as both sides, in many ways, through this kind of polite diplomatic language, also kind of construct the relationship, one where the cities acknowledge the realities of the king's power, but also one where the king makes sure to sort of pay lip service to the city's autonomy. And again, these negotiations, ever ongoing, we sometimes have preserved epigraphically. That is, when a city has a long set of negotiations, oftentimes with various kings, to make sure that the next king knows what kind of negotiation has gone before, knows what kinds of concessions have been made. They will actually inscribe the back and forth letters to and from the king, so that all can see, so that the nature of the relationship is actually transparent. And these letters, of course, are a very, very important historical source. Again, epigraphy is the study of inscriptions that are carved into stone. The inscription usually refers to the actual cutting. So when I refer to epigraphy as a source, that's I'm referring to documents that has been inscribed into stone. And unlike documents written on papyrus, documents on stone sometimes last so that we can still read them today. Indeed, epigraphy is a kind of specialty within the study of ancient history. One final note on how kings can control cities before next time we'll look at some other sort of cities that enjoy a strange, or at least some form of kind of autonomy and agency. But the easiest way for a king to control a city is to found them. Indeed, kings, while they have to deal with these pre-existing Greek polis that have a memory of their own past, may even a memory of their military glories, Hellenistic kings like founding cities as a way of controlling territory. And of course, the person who really invents this is Alexander, right? He sprinkles the old Achaemenid Empire with cities called Alexandria. The most famous one is in Egypt, and Alexandria will eventually become effectively the capital city of the Ptolemaic dynasty. That's where the Ptolemaic necropolis is organized around Alexander's mummified body, and it will eventually be one of the largest cities in the Hellenistic world, and going forward, one of the largest cities in the ancient world, eventually rivaled only by Rome. So kings can found cities, and again, oftentimes they will, when they found these cities, will set them up with sort of the mechanisms of civic autonomy. These cities will have an ecclesia or an bulle, an assembly and a council, so they can make their own decisions. A lot of these cities are veterans' colonies, and this is particularly important in the Seleucid Empire, since the Seleucids inherit much of what had been the Achaemenid Empire. And the Seleucids are great city founders. Many of the cities have dynastic names. The most important Seleucid cities are the Tetrapolis in Syria, Antioch, Apamea, Laodicea on the sea, and Seleucia. And there are actually many other cities that are named Antioch and Seleucia, including Seleucia on the Tigris. We'll talk more about the Seleucid Empire and its imperial geography, but suffice to say, they throw up a lot of these big dynastic cities. These cities are oftentimes settled with military settlers who are given land, and in exchange for this land, those settlers are expected to serve in the Seleucid army. And this is a way of organizing territory. The city can subsequently control territory, collect taxes, pay those taxes to the king. It's a way of ensuring military manpower, since the cities grant land. People who own that land owe military service. The cities themselves keep track of the soldiers, and when the king says, I need soldiers, he doesn't have to go soldier to soldier. The cities have a muster list. They raise the soldiers, send them to the king when he needs them. And so therefore, for kings, the easiest way to control a city is to found one, and then you have this nice administrative unit that you can use to control the territory that you rule. So the kings as city founders is actually a very major theme of how kings use cities to govern their empires. All right, so we're going to talk more, but I think that's all for now. I'll see you later this week.